They say you have to climb a Himalayan mountain or trek across the Antarctic to become a great explorer. Well, I disagree. England has some fabulous places just waiting to be discovered by the would-be adventurer. My name is Richard Vobes, and I want to uncover the history of this fabulous country through its towns and villages, its people and customs. I think many have forgotten why England is so special and that its past is so fascinating. I may not have a full head of hair or be the world's greatest intellect, but I'm eager, keen and enthusiastic to learn. So you could say, I'm the bald explorer. Today I'm going to Lewes, the county town of East Sussex. Historic, intriguing, religious, independent, full of character, and oh yeah, it's got its own brewery. Superb. Trouble is, it's not an easy place to park, especially if you've got your mobile home attached to the tail end. So I think I'm going to have to find somewhere a little more suitable to leave the Eriba Puck. Luckily for me, Lewes is surrounded with plenty of countryside, wedged as it is between the chalky hills of the glorious South Downs. So, having sorted out my accommodation, I'm off to explore. The River Ouse is the ancient navigation that leads to the town centre, and here, a couple of local residents. Oh. If you check your map of southern England and find Brighton, you'll see that Lewes is approximately 7 miles northeast of there. Essentially, it's a busy through town with narrow roads which are bustling with life from determined shoppers. The architecture is attractive, and of course, it's a magnet for tourists from all over. But once you've dumped your car, it's best seen on foot. Of course, it can all be a bit daunting if you don't know what you're looking at. Well, luckily for me, I've got the official Lewes guidebook to help me on my way. The only problem is, it was printed in 1951. Well, my guide might be out of date, but have things changed all that much? I mean, this chap still seems to be in business, and the historical past won't have altered any. So what does this guide actually tell us about this old, ancient town? Well, quaint as it may be, Lewes for a long time was the hub of Sussex administration. It was built on a burr by the Saxons and had a protective wall enclosing it during the Norman period. The High Street is the thoroughfare of the town, but some of the buildings are old, very old, or positively ancient. Now, the most dramatic building was the castle, and that's what I'm off to see next, if I can work out exactly where it is. Welcome to Lewes Castle. This is the lovely 14th century Barbican Gate here at Lewes Castle. The main body of the castle is just up there. And of course, that's where all the tourists like to go. So I think we should put on our party dresses and become a tourist. So here's the Bald Explorer's Guide to Lewes Castle. After the Battle of Hastings and the Norman invasion of 1066, William the Conqueror gave the town and huge swathes of land to his companion William de Warenne. De Warenne then built the castle as protection for his army and to help enforce his laws. Of course, over the years, the castle's had various additions and modifications made to it, with part of the bailey even becoming a bowling green. And what is unusual is that it had 2 defensive mottes. They're the sort of hilly things that the keep or the tower usually sits on. And although the castle was never actually besieged or saw any main defensive action, it's slowly fallen to bits over the years, with much of the masonry finding its way into other local buildings. But I still think it's a good place to visit. Of course, castles like this weren't just fortified strongholds. They were also there to intimidate the conquered population, just to show them who's boss. And I think in its day, it would have done jolly good, don't you? The castle was just the start of making Lewes the centre of the county's administration. Rules were laid down, the law upheld, and any sentences swiftly carried out. Well, the law courts are still here, but they no longer dangle folk on the end of a rope or burn them at the stake. But all that did go on in Lewes's grisly past. More of that later. Right, time to have a bit more of a shufti and a further exploration. What I really like about Lewes is the conspicuous absence of all the large chain stores. And here, thriving by the looks of things, are plenty of independent shops, which must make retail therapy an absolute bliss.
These sort of Georgian market towns have somehow retained their atmosphere, even despite being developed in more modern times. I love the town. Being an 18th century historian, of course, it's steeped in that particular period, as well as having medieval and more modern architecture as well. And then, of course, the record office in the castle is superb and a wonderful resource for any researcher into the history of West Sussex.
The origin of the name Lewes is probably Saxon, and it may mean hill. Well, it sure is hilly. And in fact, the high street is pretty high up, and running from it is a whole series of narrow lanes and passages, commonly known locally as twittons. You really get the sense that the Lewisians look after and take pride in their ancient town, and yet at the same time it's not twee or prissy or over-manicured to resemble something it isn't. There's a real sense of life and respect in the town, and although it's steeped in historical importance, it isn't spoon-fed to the visitor, it's just there. And being built mostly on a hill, you do get that comforting hug of security. I like it. Now this is Care Street. Legend has it that George IV, when he was the Prince Regent, wagered that he could drive a coach and four down this impossibly steep, cobbled lane. Well, that must have been quite scary. But what I'd like to have seen was him try and get it back up again. But the architecture is absolutely splendid. Some of these Georgian-looking buildings are actually much older, with the original timber frames on the inside. And I don't know if you've noticed that they've got these weird-looking appendages on the fronts of their buildings. They're boot scrapers. Very essential for good housekeeping. So what we can deduce is that when the houses were built, the road, obviously, with its cobbles, wasn't originally here, so that every bit of muck and dirt and smelly deposit from the horses, which of course would have been everywhere, would have to be swiftly removed on there before entering your plush abode. So I suppose the heyday of Lewes would have been in the Georgian period, when you had the bustling markets, professional classes moving in, street lighting, pavements, and all that. And the Prince Regent was a regular visitor to Lewes, mainly to the racecourse a little to the north of the town. And other important people from history started to reside in Lewes, such as author Thomas Paine, doctor and paleontologist Gideon Mantle. Oh yeah, and Daisy Ashford. Daisy Ashford isn't a name that I'm terribly familiar with. She was really only famous for something she wrote when she was about 9 years old, which was then later published. Hi Anna.
Hi Richard.
How are you?
Nice to see you. Please do come in.
Thank you very much, thank you. Anna Agilia Corney now lives in one of the apartments of this great white mansion. But it was in the upper playroom that Daisy wrote her famous book, The Young Visitors.
The house was divided into apartments, so you have, I think, 8 apartments, and then there's separate houses on the outside, but the main house was divided into 8 apartments.
Although originally written in 1890, the book wasn't published until 1919, when Daisy was in her late 30s, and it's been in print ever since.
As soon as we moved, we were shown the book, and then we found out about Daisy Ashford.
I think I better add this book to my reading list.
She did write another one afterwards, but I think she's very well known for writing The Young Visitors.
So well done, Daisy. Now remember that William de Warenne character? You know, the one that built the castle? Well, I'm off to visit his priory, the Priory of St Pancras. No, not the train station in London, but the religious house of the Cluniac monks, or at least their ruins. There doesn't seem as much of the vast and splendid buildings that there once was, and I think we can put that down to Henry VIII and his henchman Cromwell. Thomas, not Oliver. Yes, it was Thomas Cromwell that dreamt up the dissolution of the monasteries scheme as a way for Henry VIII to make a small fortune selling off the religious buildings to the local gentry. William de Warenne founded the priory towards the end of the 11th century, and the monks were famed for their splendid buildings, which now are mostly gone. But in its day, St Pancras was absolutely stunning. The main church was bigger than Chichester Cathedral. And for those of you who don't know, it's quite big. And then there were shed loads of other ancillary buildings, such as chapels, infirmaries, dormitories, oh yeah, and toilets. Yes, it transpires that the Silent Order of Cluniac monks were very big on lavatories. Come and have a look at this. In the 1940s and 50s, you were considered well off if you had a small outbuilding that housed the porcelain bog. Shut the door, read the paper, do your business. Simple. So, roll the clock back 1,000 years, and these monks had water closets in absolute splendour. They would pull up their robes and do their deposits high up in a personal cubicle above a conduit which would take away the effluent, probably to the River Ouse, where on the banks is some poor sod fishing for his supper and catches it on the end of his rod. Of course, it wasn't all about squatting in the small room and pushing one out. The main duties of the Cluniac monks were prayer and contemplation. They attended umpteen church services and grew all their own produce. A pretty quiet life then. But the priory did play one particular important part, not only in Lewes's history, but all of England. What happened here in the mid-13th century changed the way the country was to be governed forever. I'm climbing Offham Hill, which is a few miles north of Lewes. It's a hill that caused a lot of fuss in England in 1264. The Battle of Lewes was one of the 2 main battles of conflict known as the Second Barons' War, and the first was staged on the hills above Lewes. It was all the doings of a French-born noble, Simon de Montfort. Now an English baron, he started an uprising against King Henry III. He and his cronies were increasingly worried about the king's personal style of government, particularly his inability to consult the nobles on any of his decisions, or indeed take any sensible advice. Henry III was unpopular. He was extravagant and greedy. He refused to listen to his advisors and tended to favour his French relatives, heaping substantial amounts of power upon them. The English nobility, including the Earl of Leicester and brother-in-law to the King, Simon de Montfort, wished to restore the Magna Carta and force the King to surrender some of his power for the good of the nation. Initially, he agreed, but soon the King went back to his old ways of personal rule. The barons were furious and raised a force against the King and headed for Sussex. It was time the people made a stand. De Montfort and his supporters decided to surprise the King and came up here on this hill that overlooks Lewes. De Montfort and his baronial army were comprised mostly of inexperienced but enthusiastic followers, many from London. They may have lacked the numbers to match the King, but they had the element of surprise and the advantage of height. And if they played their cards right, they might just win. It was the 14th of May 1264. A royal outlooker had spotted Simon de Montfort and his mob here on the top of Offham Hill. The King, his army, Prince Edward, clambered out of their pyjamas quickly, eager to have a chance to duff up de Montfort once and for all. Arrogant as ever, the King and his men were not at all worried about the tin pot army at the top of the hill. But they should have been. The opposing sides gathered and readied themselves for the slaughter that was now inevitable to take place that day. And so finally, I've reached the top of the hill, and now we get the wonderful vantage view of Lewes town. And it's here you can see in this wonderful grassy meadow that it's more or less as it was, as Simon de Montfort's divisions are here. He had 3 main groups of men and 1 held in reserve, facing the royal troops. The battle lines were drawn, tensions were high, nerves taut. Each eyeballed one another, and death stared straight back. Suddenly, the Londoners, a division of de Montfort's, are scared. They're terrified. They're not used to battle. They're not used to war. They're ordinary people. They're merchants. They're tanners, blacksmiths, that sort of thing. They're scared. They can see the trained army of the royalists approaching. They suddenly broke ranks. And they fled. Prince Edward sees this. In his inexperience, he takes a flank and he follows them. And he charges after the Londoners as they flee through the villages down past the Ouse, many of them getting stuck in the bog and the marshes, and Prince Edward and his army are thrashing them to bits. No mercy. Bodies are strewn all over this place. This leaves the King open to easy attack. And seeing their moment, de Montfort brings his forces in and charges down the hill into the town. With their whatever weapons they had, they engaged the enemy. The bloody battle continued all day, with hundreds killed, many wounded and dying strewn along the slopes and around the town. King Henry realised he was virtually defeated, and he made this retreat right the way back south of the town to the Priory, where they bolted all the doors and hid inside. Henry was captured along with the returning Prince Edward and held in the Priory just here until he finally admitted defeat. He wasn't killed, but Simon de Montfort was now effectively in charge. And this, in the Priory grounds, is a rather beautiful sculpture, I think, of a knight's helmet, which commemorates that very important battle, the Battle of Lewes. Luckily, these days, the sort of battles taking place in Lewes are a lot friendlier. Almost exclusive to the town is the ancient pub game of Toad in the Hole.
As I understand it, before the 70s, most areas in Britain had games like this. You had Toad in the Hole, Shove Halfpenny. There's a few that have survived. Here it's Toad in the Hole, and quite why it's here I don't know. There's a similar game in France, so it's possible that because we're near France somebody brought it over. Basically you have 4 toads. These are toads, they're brass coins, and you throw them from about 8 feet away, same distance as a darts board, so you can use, often they sit under the darts board and you use the oche. It's deceptively simple. I think that when you play a lot and you play in the league and the big competitions we have around here, it's noticeable that the same people win over and over again.
So of course I wanted to prove that I was a dab hand with the toads, but failed miserably. Still, the beer was good and the company excellent. But I had heard about a brewery that was a big noise in the town, so naturally I wanted to find out more. According to their website, Harvey's claimed to be the oldest brewery in Sussex, dating back to 1790. I don't think the buildings had changed that much either. The business was started by a John Harvey, who started out as a wine and port importer, and later, in the early 19th century, he began to brew beer at the edge of the River Ouse, initially as a sideline. Well, it obviously took off because they've been supplying pubs all over the county ever since. Harvey's might be the only brewery in town at the moment, but in the 18th century, the town was awash with brewers. It was a very noble profession. Now look at this. This is interesting. This must be the old communal water pump from 1830. But I don't think it's seen much water for a very long time, judging by these poor dried up flowers. The pub that I'm visiting next had more than its fair share of water, but in the dangerous guise of unwanted snow.
The Snowdrop Inn was built in 1840, we think. There was certainly a pub here by 1840. It was built on the site of the worst ever avalanche in British history, which happened the day after Boxing Day in 1836.
This ridge had collected heavy snow, and on that fateful day it came crashing down on the houses below.
It wasn't just a single avalanche, there had been a couple of avalanches the day before, and there was an avalanche during the rescue. One of the rescuers was in fact buried and then dug out and then carried on. At the time this would have been a largely industrial area. There was a timber yard just down the road. There was a workhouse down the road. There was cement works and chalk cuttings in the cliff behind. It would have been quite a rough, grim place. I mean, the terraced cottages that were crushed were called Boulder Row, and they were poor people's houses. We think they were kind of almshouses provided by the parish. The avalanche was right at the end of 1836. There was a pub here by 1840. It would have been very, very fresh in people's memories.
As I explore the town, there's one name that keeps cropping up time and time again. It's vaguely familiar, but who is it?
He is one of the founding fathers of America, and he left from Lewes. He'd lived here for 6 years. So what he does and says in America is of great interest to us. And what did he learn here?
His name was Thomas Paine, and he was an 18th century author, intellectual and revolutionary. He was born in Norfolk and emigrated to America in 1774, but before that he had stayed in Lewes.
He started a tobacconist business here. He was on the parish of the St Michael's, on the council that dealt with the poor law, and he would observe the assizes in the High Street. They were outside the White Hart. So he was living in a republic. Lewes was running like a republic.
His revolutionist ideas were conceived at meetings at his home and at the White Hart Inn. He dreamt of a self-regulating state, an administration that was not governed by an hereditary king.
So when he went to America and proposed a republic there, he said, I know you can live without a king. 17 months after he leaves Lewes, he writes Common Sense, the single unifying piece of writing, the pamphlet Common Sense, that stirs the colonists to the War of Independence. He then follows that up with 13 crisis papers, the beginning of which everybody knows, these are the times that try men's souls. He steadies the American troops through, with 13 crisis papers, through the War of Independence. We assert that this is the only place Americans can come where Lewes is like a diorama. They can see where one of their founding fathers slept, lived, married, played bowls, debated in the pub, walked the streets. It's just the same.
Lewes remains a free-thinking place, an ideal home to its revolutionaries and freedom fighters. It inspires and opens one's heart to unlimitless possibilities. A little to the north, on the old London road, we come to this, the Chalk Pit Inn and Restaurant. And by golly, there is the Chalk Pit, which is rather magnificent. Let's find out some more. I think we go in this way. Originally, it was an old quarry works, extracting chalk and producing lime in the Victorian era. Now it's a friendly pub, and landlord John Miles invited me to come and have a look at the kilns and the abandoned tunnels from the old railway once here. So, John, this was an old chalk pit.
Yes, yep, 1790s. The chalk was started here.
Oh, really? As far back as here?
Yeah, as far back as here. The front of the building used to be the offices, and all this has been built on since.
Right.
And the chalk's been excavated from here all the way back.
That's a hefty bit of chalk.
It is many a ton. It was for building. They put the chalk into a furnace or on a kiln, and they made quicklime out of it, and then took it down on barges, down the railway, on barges down to the river, and then it went down to Newhaven. There are several chalk pits around here.
Yeah, I've seen on the old maps, they're sort of scattered around.
Well, the first one was this one up the top here. You can't really see it because it's been excavated, and then they excavated through here, and then they excavated all of this as well.
So this is what's left of the kilns.
Yeah, we think there was 5 or 6 running all the way around in a circle here. You can see that they've all fallen in, caved in, and they go sort of like 7 foot backwards.
So they're quite small. So I was thinking of quite industrial. For the amount of chalk here, you imagine.
Well, I didn't. As I say, I think there was more than just the 2. We've got the 2 here, but I think there must have been 6 or 7, in a sort of around here. And then they had carts that went down to the railway, and then we think it was one of the first vernacular railways in southern England.
A funicular is an inclined railway. Sometimes you see them at seaside resorts coming down the cliff face. Using a pulley system, carriages on tracks or rails can be raised up and down the side of a steep slope, moving goods or people. Unfortunately, there's not very much left on the chalk pit site, but there are some very intriguing tunnels, and I do like tunnels. This is the little tunnel shaft that goes down to the other end, and this is where the funicular trucks obviously would have been a little bit more spacious here, but you can go right down to the end. And just see if I can get down here a bit like that, and you've got this beautiful brick archway, and these trucks would have gone up and down here. The interesting thing is that the empty trucks would have been brought up by the full trucks in the other passageway going down. So it had a sort of natural pulley system, which I think is very clever. So it's not really as steep as you might think. I mean, if you rolled down here drunk, you might, of course, have a few problems, but if you're an explorer like me, we've survived. High up above Lewes, on Cliff Hill, is this very strange looking obelisk. It's a memorial to something that happened 450 years ago. It reads, "In loving memory of the undernamed 17 Protestant martyrs who, for their faithful testimony to God's truth during the reign of Queen Mary, were burned to death in front of the then Star Inn, now the Town Hall in Lewes." And then it goes on to say that the obelisk was provided by public subscriptions and erected in 1901. Yet this event took place in the 16th century. Queen Mary, otherwise known, of course, as Bloody Mary. But what a terror that name brings to mind. But I gather that Mary was a much maligned queen, and while, yes, she did authorise the death of 300 people who didn't quite agree with her religion, apparently she was a devoted and pious woman. Now, I agree it is completely difficult to feel sorry for a tyrant who orders her subjects to be burnt at the stake, but you've got to understand the times and the importance that religion played on the psyche of the population. Religion was everything. From the moment you were born, how you worshipped your God mattered, and it determined whether you would ultimately be united with the Holy Father or burn in the fires of hell. The old Star Inn has long since gone. But back in the 16th century, the burnings of the 17 Protestant martyrs would actually have been great public occasions. And although awful to our 21st century sensibilities, at the time, the burnings of heretics were normal and accepted. Now, in its place, stands this very splendid red brick town hall. It's claimed that the martyrs were held in the cellars of the Star Inn the night before taken to the pyre. And if that's true, they must have had plenty of resolve if they managed to get any sleep at all. Some historians suggest that the martyrs were no more than troublemakers, or at the very least repeat offenders, whom authority had bent over backwards initially to prevent their execution. The burning of the martyrs, although gruesome, is remembered along with the gunpowder plot every 5th of November. It's a very highly visual spectacle for which Lewes has now become famous. Well, I'm right at the end of my exploration of this fine old Sussex market town. There's plenty more that I could have investigated, of course, such as Anne of Cleves House, Mount Caburn and its Iron Age hill fort, and the curious sunken salt pans, which are now the home to the local football ground. But before I go, there is just time to seek out a little recreation.
We open mid-May to mid-September. It's an unheated pool at the moment, spring water fed. It is pumped up from a little pump in a pump house by the side of the pool, and it goes straight into the pool every day, or when we want it. We just had some repairs done to the pool, so this year is a bit of a test for us. We're hoping to improve the water temperatures because we had to put so much cold water in every day. So this year, with the repairs we've had done, we're going to test it and then look to try and heat it somehow from next year onwards
It's 46 metres long by 23 metres. In the old money that would be 50 yards by 25 yards. So in the old days that would be sort of Olympic size. We open, historically it used to be the end of May, but now it's mid-May and we run till mid-September. If we have an Indian summer, then we just open for limited hours, up to as long as we can go, really. And in the past we've stayed open until the end of September. Yeah, but it was a bit fresh then, I must admit.